So, having done all of that, I put a brief biography of Natalie Byfield in the program. She is a former reporter for the New York Daily News, and she's here with her husband and partner, Clarence Shepard, who's a visual journalist, and also Melvin McRae from ABC. And, but what I really want to say, and she's covered really some of the major stories, particularly of the 1980s and 90s in the New York area, and she's going to talk about some of that today. But what I want to say about Natalie Byfield is that in addition to all of the professional credentials, that this, from the moment that I first met her 24 years ago, okay, she's always impressed me as one of the smartest, most articulate, most passionate and principled people that I've known in my life. And so I think we'll all be privileged to hear what she has to say. So without further ado, Natalie Byfield.
Well, Kim, thank you so much for having me here. I couldn't be happier, honestly. It's great to see you, and it's great to receive such a warm greeting. I prepared a statement presentation, but I have a habit of just speaking. So I more or less know what I'm going to say, so I'm just going to take it sort of from there and give you a sense of why I feel the way I do about the things that have happened in my life and where those things have brought me now. I was one of those people who, when I was in college, and this will probably be something that many of the younger people here can relate to, I had no idea what I was going to do when I left college. And the easiest thing for me to do was to go to graduate school because I thought, okay, I don't know what I'm going to do, so I'll go to graduate school. So I end up there and decide, I know, I am going to go into writing. And my decision to go into writing led me to the Jesse Jackson campaign when he ran for president in '84. And I worked in the issues office. And my job was to keep up with all the issues and make sure he didn't contradict himself in his statements and do some research and straighten out the issues papers that were being sent in. And as it so happens, campaigns being what they are, things happen on the fly, and I developed a reputation for being able to answer questions really quickly for the media. So instead of calling the press office, a lot of times they would call the issues office to get the information they needed for their stories. So I started talking to journalists, and I thought, oh my God, what a great job. They get to just go. They get to do what it is. I mean, this is how it felt to me at the time, and I was really young, and it was an incredible opportunity for me to have at that age. And I thought, this is going to be my life. It incorporates everything about me that I want to develop. I want to write, I want to meet people, I want to get out, and I want to learn about the world. And I moved back to New York from DC, and I start to try and get a job in the media, and then I get a real education. So Princeton and Stanford just hadn't cut the mustard as far as I was concerned because my education was just about to begin. When I came back to New York, I sent my resume around and people sort of looked at me and thought, what does she know? What can she do? Anyway, I wised up really quickly and I picked something that I wanted to do, and I figured if I became a copy editor, then at least I would learn something about the field that would help hopefully take me into writing. And I sent my resume around, and one of the things that was helpful was that people responded to my sort of unusual background and my backdoor way into journalism. So I got a lot of calls in to come and copy edit, but I didn't know what I was doing, and they would give me these tests, and I would flunk the test, so I would never get a job. And what ended up happening, though, was every time I flunked a test, I would call the person, I would beg them, please show me what I did wrong so that I can learn. And eventually, I get a job as a copy editor. And I'm working at The American Lawyer. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with this publication. It was a flagship publication of a legal journalism empire that was started by Steve Brill, the man who later went on to create Court TV and has since sold it and now does Brill's content. And he was my journalism professor, basically, and he was rigorous, he was demanding. But there were a lot of things along the way now, because of my introduction to journalism, that I didn't understand about the field. I didn't understand about the power, I didn't understand about the structure, and I didn't understand about where someone who looked like me, an African-American woman, would fit into this field. And these were lessons that I was forced to learn along the way. So eventually now, I get this job at the American Lawyer, and I'm trying my best. And you know, as far as I'm concerned, I'm doing a great job. And they're telling me I'm doing a great job, except little things start to happen. I find out about a great story, it's a big legal story going on in Texas, and I go to the managing editor and I say, I want to work on this story. And he says to me, oh, well, I don't know that that's really a story. And I thought, oh, okay, fine, I'll get more information for you. While I'm in the process of collecting more information, I notice on the next month's edition, the story schedule, that this story is going to be done and it's going to be written by one of the Texas reporters. And I thought, oh. So, you know, of course I take offense to this. I go into the managing editor, how could you do this? Well, he had more information than you did. Did you even know about the story before I brought it to your attention? He just sort of looks at me, you know, I don't know what this woman's talking about. And I go into Steve Brill and I demand, how could you let this happen? Why is this happening? Well, Natalie, you know, and I learned a lot from those because along the way, as my career developed, I got a lot of I don't really know why that happened. It just sort of happened. So this is my introduction to journalism. It's the mid-1980s. It's a time when the service sector is booming in New York, yuppies, buppies, that kind of terminology is moving in, and this is what people are talking about. New York was retooling itself to service this sector of this population, young kids, most of them kids really, moving in from all over the country with college education who wanted to get a fast-track, fast-paced job to a lot of money. And the city was meant for those people. And they decided we're going to retool the city for this purpose. At the same time, we're getting something else going on in the city, an African-American mayor. We get an African-American mayor in New York City around this time. So this is the backdrop to which I get introduced to journalism in New York City. But I talk about my naivete and really my lack of understanding about the field a lot, because I think for the most part, now when I look back and I read studies about it, they say for the most part across the country, a lot of young journalists really don't understand the profession. They don't understand how it works. They don't understand the motivations of the profession. They don't understand the structure of the profession. And this is a really important thing for you to know before you go out there and start to work in journalism, so that you understand why certain demands are being made of you. So I'm basically like a lot of other journalists out there. And in the mid-'80s, when I joined, the mid to late '80s now, as I'm developing the profession, there are about 7% of the journalists working at daily newspapers are minorities. They're just a smidgen, basically. And we're coming off of 2% African Americans in 1968, when the Kerner Commission did its reports after the rioting and said, this can't be. We have an America divided, and America must not be divided. And one of the reasons that America is divided is because of the way the media covers race, one, or its lack of coverage of race, and two, because of the type of coverage of the African American community. And even after that sort of criticism, and that was laid at the feet of the media the media entities in the country, not much was done. We had 2% African American representation in '68, and by the late 1980s, and these figures in the late 1980s, these figures now are coming from the American Society of Newspaper Editors. When I'm joining the field and trying to find my way, 7% people of color, completely, not just African Americans. So nothing much has changed, but something else has changed. I'm a product of the age of integration, and I have been told, and I believe this with all my heart, that my color will not hold me back. So this is the context in which I joined this profession, in which it's basically a profession about power and money and maintaining power and money in the hands that have always had power and money. And I am not, in a certain way, I'm not as aware of it as I need to be, but in a way that's good, because then I don't feel limited. And I go on and I argue my points without thinking in terms of, oh my goodness, these people are going to say, get out of here any second now. I go in there and I argue my points because I feel I should argue these points with them. The points that eventually it crystallizes in my mind that I'm arguing with my editors have to do with my whole perspective. Am I viewing the world from a Eurocentric perspective? And when I talk about Eurocentrism, you know, in academia you hear a lot about that, and there's a real academic definition for Eurocentrism, and I can get into that later when I take questions. But in terms of in the media how this plays out, the Eurocentric perspective means that the system always works, doesn't it? Even when you're writing a story about the system messing up, you can't actually come out and say, and you know, maybe we should change something here, because ultimately everything needs to come back to the system always working. So that's really one of the tenets of this Eurocentric perspective that we are expected to uphold when we work in these organizations. Another one is that democracy, as it exists here, doesn't exist anywhere else in the world, and we don't really think in terms of the rest of the world being as democratic as this nation. And this nation is moving ahead to greater developments in democracy every day. And when stories crop up, and we've seen these stories that challenge it, they become very sensitive stories. And oftentimes these are stories around the issues of race. One of these such stories was, and I could go through a list, but for today I'm going to focus on a few things. The Central Park jogger story. And those of you who are old enough to remember 1989, April of 1989, when a young investment banker, a yuppie as we called them back then, was jogging through Central Park late one night. She was from a relatively affluent background. You know, America is so strange when we talk about affluence. She went to college and her parents have jobs and certain things happen, so it's a relatively affluent background. And she's white, and she works on Wall Street. And this is the segment of the population that at the time the city is really catering to, and they want everyone to know and understand from all over the country that the city is safe for these people. Anyway, she's jogging late one night and she is attacked by a group of African American and Latino youth. Now, journalism being what it is, and those of you here who work on Unbound, I'm sure from your work with Professor Pearson, you have a good sense of how it's set up and assignments and things like that. I'm getting dressed in the morning and I'm listening to the news on the radio about this story. And the frequency with which they're reporting this story says to me, oh, this is a big one, and it's going to be a big one. Maybe I'll get a chance to work on it, because I'm hoping to get a piece of this story. It's a natural instinct. I'm a journalist. I want a piece of this story. It's a big story. She's right. You're only as good as your last story. And no one pretends it's any other way. So of course I want to work on this story. I'm not crazy. So I go in there with this attitude, I want to get on this story. And of course you're angling, because we always angle. I'm angling to figure out, how am I going to get away on this story? And they're handing out assignments. But it's a big enough story where they're giving pieces to a whole lot of people. And the piece I get is to go to the hospital, and I think, oh no, go to the hospital? Some administrator's going to come down every 4 hours and give me some quote that I have to call in, and that'll be the end of my day. And then, you know, tomorrow, when they want to send other people out, they're not going to send me out. So whatever, I get the hospital assignment, and it's not supposed to be a great assignment, but I go there. And I do the obnoxious thing. I nag that poor PR woman. I go upstairs, I ride the elevators, I walk around. Don't you know you're supposed to stay downstairs? And I listen to all that stuff, and okay, fine. I go downstairs, and on one of my trips downstairs, I see this couple standing in the lobby. Now, the jogger is at Metropolitan Hospital, which is at 96th Street and 1st Avenue. And it's a border. It's one of those new borders in the city where everything above there is questionable. And if you really know what you're doing and you care about your safety and you come from certain backgrounds, you don't move up there. You don't move uptown. I've had people say to me, when I lived on 129th Street, well, you know, I can't take you home because I don't go over 110th Street. So 110th Street on the west side was one border, and 96th Street on the east side was yet another border. So it's one of those border areas, and we get the developers are, you know, building up the apartment buildings, and the rents are going sky high. We're talking now about $1,200 a month apartments, and she lives in this area that's being developed, and she's running in Central Park late at night on the 102nd Street Traverse, and it's the northern end of Central Park, you know, ooh. So I go downstairs, and usually the people in the lobby are usually African American and Latino, and they're usually from working class backgrounds. But I see this couple standing in the lobby, and they stand out, and I think those are her parents. So a hospital administrator goes over, and they meet these people, and they say, and they talk for a while, and I sneak back on the elevator with them. And I don't really sneak back, I just walk back on the elevator with them, because no one assumes I'm a reporter, because 7% of the journalists are African American. There's no reason why anyone should think I'm a reporter. So I go on the elevator, and I overhear the conversation, and they're basically preparing the family for the condition they're going to find her in, and she's in bad shape. Something really horrible has happened to her. But I overhear the conversation, and I go back downstairs, and I call it in, and my editors decide that that was just great instincts. Look what she got. She called us in. Wonderful. So the next day I get sent to the hospital. I get sent to the hospital daily for about 4 months after that. We don't cover a story for 4 months like that. Think of the resources that are invested when you have a reporter assigned to one story like it's a beat for 4 months. There is what this translates into is that there's a concerted effort to keep this story in the news. So while something horrible has happened to this young woman, it's now being exploited by the media for other ends, because the media has an agenda. And that's something that I had to learn along the way, because it wasn't clear to me initially exactly what that agenda was, but the media had an agenda. And it has an agenda. And it has an international agenda different from its domestic agenda, but it has an agenda. And the agenda at that time with the African-American mayor was, one of the things was to embarrass. So this story was staying in the newspaper. And I was sent to the hospital every day for about 4 months. And, you know, they would say to me, I would call in, because when you're out, you call in regularly. I'd call in and I'd say, well, nothing happened today. What do you mean nothing happened? Anything, tell us something. Her temperature went up. How many people remember the headline, temperature 103? Front page. I was making the front pages with this story. Temperature goes up, or another one. On this one I got reamed for. She talks. Because my unimpeachable source, when I said, is she talking yet? He said, oh, no, not really. And I did the bad journalist thing, and I didn't say, well, what do you mean by not really? She apparently said something relatively incoherent, but apparently the Post reporter found out that she had said something, even though it was relatively incoherent, and the Post went with, she talks, big, big, big type. So I got reamed for that. So the next time I went to them and I said, you know, she met with the DA and she doesn't remember anything. They looked at me and they said, I hope you're willing to bet your mortgage on it. So they're serious about their agenda, and I need to get with the program if I'm gonna stick with this business in this way. Anyway, I'm working the story, and I'm getting a lot of attention, and some of the attention is really negative attention, and I'm getting a lot of negative attention from the African American community, because on the same night that the woman was raped in Central Park, an African American woman was raped in Brooklyn. She was raped on the rooftop of a building and tossed over the building. She was naked, tossed naked over the building. She had also been brutally beaten. She got tangled in cable wires hanging over the building and was literally banging against someone's window, and that's how she was found. Have you heard of this story? No. No. So yes, I'm getting a lot of negative attention, because in my position as a reporter, shouldn't I also be covering these other issues and not simply covering this one story? But as one lone reporter, you don't, in the setup there, have the opportunity to always dictate, because in the meetings, and they meet twice a day in the morning to give you a preliminary book, and at the end of the day, this is going to be the front page and this is what we've collected. In the meetings, usually, 90% of the time, I have to dictate, because in the meetings, and they meet twice a day in the morning to give you a preliminary book, and at the end of the day, this is going to be the front page and this is what we've collected. In the meetings, usually, 90% of the time, I have to dictate, because in the meetings, and they meet twice a day in the morning to give you a preliminary book, and at the end of the day, this is going to be the front page and this is what we've collected. African Americans are not represented, because when you look at some of the statistics now on who's represented in the higher echelons of the field, the numbers are even smaller, much, much smaller, something like 1%. So who's going to speak about the discomfort the African American community has with the seeming lack of balance in the coverage of this story? But it gets even better. One day I am asked by a youth organization to attend a press conference at a community organization that's based at 110th Street and Central Park North. So 110th and 5th, which is really right around Central Park North, which is in the area where the attack had taken place. And I go to the press conference, and there's another reporter there, I think from New York Magazine. And I'm going there because I'm covering the story, basically, but I have to justify to my editor, why am I leaving the hospital to go here? I says, well, you know, we really haven't covered the community very much, and maybe as part of the balance of the totality of our coverage, maybe I would need to also attend this meeting and get another perspective also, because it's a big story. So he couldn't think of a way to get around that, so he basically let me go and cover this thing. When I attend this meeting, I'm told by the young people there that groups of larger than 3 African American or Latino youths who are walking through Central Park are stopped, and they're carded, they're asked for ID. If they can't present ID, they're threatened with incarceration for 72 hours, because that's the amount of time you can keep someone incarcerated without a charge. Yes, this is what was going on. So I go back to my editors and I said, we've got to write a story about this. And I got this quiet look. I don't know if that's a news story. Maybe you ought to go to the feature section. Maybe they could use it. Ooh, look. I said, this is a civil rights story, and it pertains to the largest story in the city right now. I think it's a hard news story. Well, go see if the suburban section wants it. I go to the suburban section, and the editor looks at me like I've lost my mind. No, that's not. Go over there to the city desk and give them that. I said, well, they don't want that story. And he said, well, maybe try the Sunday editor. And I think, oh, yes, smart. Go to Sunday. They have a circulation of 2.1 million. It'll get out more. Go to Sunday. I go to the Sunday editor. So I tell him about the story, and he looks at me and he says, Natalie, are you angry about this? And I really, honestly, I didn't know what he was talking about. I thought, angry? Angry. Angry? How angry? I said, you know, this is a good story. It fits all the criteria that you keep telling us we should look for stories. It fits the criteria. It's a good story. Angry? Why should I be angry about this? This is something that's happening. This is something that I'm covering. Because I'd already learned by this that you never even indicate that there may be something that resonates with you that may be happening in the African American community, because that's not looked upon happily by your editors. It's looked upon with suspicion. So, okay, fine. I said, no, I'm not angry. I just think this is a good story. Well, I don't think it's a story. So I commit the big faux pas in these bureaucracies. I go over his head and I go to the editor-in-chief's head. Gil Spencer was editor-in-chief at the time, and he may be known in this area because he worked at the Philadelphia Daily News for a while. Anyway, I go to him and I say, this is what's going on. And he says, oh, this is a great story. Do it up. Go. Find a civil rights attorney. Talk to him. Talk to Ben Ward, who was the head of the police department at the time, African American also. Talk to Ben Ward. Get quotes from him. Get quotes from everybody. This is a big story. We're going to do this right. So I start doing it right. I go around and I get all my quotes, and Ben Ward won't talk to me, and he said his people are saying to me, send it in writing, and this is not a survey. Kids, we don't send things in writing. We want a comment. We want to look you in the face and talk to you. So I'm trying to get this man to talk. He won't talk to me, and then funny things start happening. I start getting Sunday assignments. Now, I was a big shot by now because I was covering the biggest story in the city. What do you mean by putting me on a Sunday assignment? I had stepped on toes. Okay, fine. So I'm getting my Sunday assignments. But luckily, I go out there and they send me to cover a parade. But guess who's the Grand Marshal? Ben Ward. So I run up to Ben Ward and I do my thing. I shove my microphone in his face and I say, can I get a comment about that? And but you know, I told you about the I. So the I comes back, I'm not going to say this is happening, and I'm not going to say it's not happening. And then his people start surrounding me and say, Natalie, back off, back off. So I thought, well, fine, you know, I got what I wanted. I got a quote. And that's the last thing I was waiting for. So I put my story together, and, you know, okay, fine, it's 24 inches, but, you know, tabloids, this is not the New York Times, right? You know, 24 inches, you're laughing. 24 inches at the Times is nothing. You know, they asked them to write that in one day, but you work at the Daily News, and it's like, hey, I could get a Pulitzer for my 24 inches now. So, okay, fine, 24 inches, great. I write up my story. And I get some great stuff here. There was actually a group of kids from Outward Bound. Now, Outward Bound is safe. We've all heard of Outward Bound. They're not a subversive organization. The kids are there in the park at night, and they're chased out the park because they can't produce ID, because this rule, it was literally department policy. They had literally passed the law. Well, not passed it, but made a policy in the department that they would stop the groups of larger than 3. And I said, you know, and my line to them was, this is not South Africa. It's not supposed to happen here. Here I go, challenging democracy in America. So I say to them, this is my story. Here it is. I turn the story in. Silence. It's deafening. Usually, and we know the deal. When you turn in a really good story and everybody's been working on it and they know it's coming in, they all surround the terminal and all the editors are peeking over, right? I'm like, they love it. That's the deal. They're all looking at it, and they're like, oh, great, great, great. I turn my story, and it's like, silence. So then I start the thing. What happened to my story? Where is it in the system? Da-da-da-da-da-da. I start the thing, the walking around the office bothering these people. Oh, it's going to run next week. Okay, next Sunday, fine. Then they call me in, and they say something about, Gil Spencer needs to talk to you. Natalie. The police source, because I got a police source other than Ben Ward that confirmed that. They were telling that when they lined up in the morning, before they went out on duty, they were told to do this. I got a police source saying this. Natalie, what's the race of that police source? What difference does it make? Well, why can't you tell us? Well, why should I tell you? So that was a standoff. Well, will you tell you? No, I'm definitely, if I'm not going to tell you what he looks like, I'm not going to tell you what his name is. So no, I'm not going to tell you. That story languished. That story languished. A month later, and mind you, when they decided to pull it from the first Sunday, it wasn't the usual poor schlep that has to work the weekend calling me to say they're not running the story. Gil Spencer was in the office talking about, Natalie, I'm afraid the story can't run. So this is happening at the highest levels of the paper that this is going on. And a month later, they run the story. They run it on a Saturday. Saturday, there are not that many commuters. 200,000. That's the circulation on Saturday. And it's run on the obit page. Wait, let me find the story. It's like this big, okay? It's so sad what they did to that story. It's this big. But it taught me a lot of lessons about what really goes on in there, and the sort of things that I need to pay attention to as a journalist. The Daily News gets a lot of, it depends on crime. Crime is like fodder. And it's not simply any crime that's fodder for the Daily News. It's not, you know, it's not any crime that's a staple. One of the things, one of my tours of duties there was to work in police headquarters. And my job was in the mornings, because I was the most recent one there. I was to go upstairs to the communications office, and it's DCPI, Deputy Commissioner for Public Information. I'd go up there, and I'd have to look at the sheets. Okay. The sheets are a listing of all the crimes, that have happened in the city the previous night, the precincts, some little blurb about it. Usually the name's misspelled, and usually it's in bad shape. So you really have to go out and do a lot of reporting, but hopefully they've gotten the precinct right. And you can find some information. So anyway, my job was to read the sheets, and I'm noticing a pattern here. Now, I grew up in Queens, And Queens, I grew up in Southeast Queens, in a large area. The section I was from is St. Albans, but it's basically Jamaica. I'm in the section that a lot of people just refer to as Jamaica. Jamaica's a huge section. And there are also other pockets in Queens, largely white pockets, because we know about housing, we know about how neighborhoods and what goes on. America is still largely segregated, and the census shows it, so I'm not just saying this to say it. Anyway, I noticed that on the sheets, most of the crimes being reported came out of precincts that were largely African American and Latino. Now, what conclusion could I draw from this? That no crime happened in the other communities? Or there was a propensity to report crimes from African American and Latino communities. And then they became the staple. So when we read the paper the next morning, the crimes being reported made certain neighborhoods look a certain way. They created fear. And we are so cynical to some degree, some of us on the inside, about these types of stories, that I've had exchanges with journalists where they're given assignments and they say, oh, yeah, they need a fear and loathing story. Come on. People are reading this. People are forming opinions about their world based on this information. And it's not, people are forming opinions about other people based on this information. Yeah, there is definitely, as far as I could see, a disproportionate amount of reporting of crimes from communities of color. And one of the things that they've since done away with since that period in time was the perp walk. Now, Professor Pearson introduced my husband, Clarence Shepard. He's a photographer, and the first time he told me about this, I was astounded. Of course, I'd worked the story, and some photographer would take the pictures. Well, you know, things happen. Photographers especially, or news crews, TV news crews, they're subject to all kinds of delay based on traffic. Things happen on the road. Now, what if you don't get there in time for the perp walk to get the picture? What do you think happens? Do you think you miss the picture? No. They will walk that person as many times as they need to walk him, so that everybody gets. NBC was always late. Anybody here from NBC? NBC was always late. And the New York Times was always late. And they would get their picture. And you know, sometimes they would yell out, the press person would yell out, the photographer, to the cop, I'll put your picture in if you let him walk again. So all those, we've seen them. You know what I'm talking about. Duck in the car, you know that perp walk. Staged, because we have to have a picture. They've since done away with that, but I think it's an important thing that people know so that they understand when I'm talking about an agenda. It's a very specific agenda. One of the things that eventually came back to me in the newsroom about the treatment of that story I worked on, with that one particular story in the Central Park coverage, was that that story offended the police department. And we rely on them for news. Look at all the stories in the Daily News that pertain to crime. You don't burn your sources. So that's one of the things that eventually made its way back to me. And that wasn't appreciated, that I pushed to get that story in the paper. What they ended up doing on some level was trying to move me off the story and sometimes assigning someone else to do certain things. Well, you know, you need help. So these are the sorts of things that shaped my opinion of how the media functions, its specific agenda, how the agenda plays out in relations in the larger community, what we think about each other based on these stories. What I see going on in the field now, and I should talk about my leaving the Daily News because it's a particularly painful story, but it's a story that I need to talk about because I think people need to understand what happened. The Daily News was in all kinds of financial problems because of as far as I could see, management, mismanagement, but you know, hey, what do I know? And based on that now, at least this is what we're hearing from management, all sorts of troubles started. The Chicago Tribune eventually sold the paper. It had been owned by the Chicago Tribune for a long time. They eventually sold the paper to Maxwell, an English newspaper baron who they thought had money until they found out he didn't have money, and the paper wound up in receivership, and he committed suicide. So that was a mess. And we survived the Tribune sale, we survived Maxwell, we survived the strike, and then eventually the paper was bought by Mortimer Zuckerman, who is a Canadian real estate developer who also owns U.S. News and World Report, and other publications that are slipping my mind right now. Anyway, the other most famous one I think he's owned for a while was U.S. News and World Report. And when he came in, they decided to downsize. That was very typical, and you know, a lot of times when companies are taken over by another entity, they often restructure and downsize. So that happened here. What the Daily News did in the process of their downsizing was to eliminate the majority of African American reporters and photographers. Largely because, and here's an interesting part of the history that was also a part of the backdrop to my working in the New York market. The downsizing took place, and they eliminated people who questioned anything that they did. So I was one of the people that, you know, it's no surprise to me, because it turned into, for me personally, it turned into a bitter battle. I don't know that it will necessarily turn into this for everyone who works in these organizations. The general point I'm trying to make is that there are certain tenets that they don't want questioned in these organizations, and when you question them, the challenge is enormous. And your job turns into a daily uphill battle. And that's largely, I believe, the case for most journalists of color, because if you do not share that perspective, then you're always walking a line, and there are going to be times when you have these confrontations. I mean, journalists in general have confrontations with their editors if they disagree with their perspective, but there's this added dimension to it when you come from another community, and that's the reality. Anyway, we were downsized, and it certainly had racial overtones because of the large numbers of African Americans who were cut from the staff at the Daily News. What I decided to do after that was not go back into daily journalism, but was to go into teaching. And my husband and I started an organization called the Black Media Foundation that our goals are to cultivate an interest in the media in disenfranchised communities, particularly communities populated by people of color. Encourage them to join the media, because despite all my experiences, I love journalism. I absolutely love it. I think it's an incredible profession. I think it's an incredible field, and I think you have the opportunity really to make change. And that was one of the reasons I joined, and I still continue to love journalism. And what I'm trying to do is encourage others to go in there and to benefit from my experiences, and also to provide support, especially when you start out, and maybe you start out like me and really don't understand what you're up against. Now, the support is a really important issue that I want to touch on in and of itself. The day I started at the Daily News was the day that it wasn't the actual trial itself, it was questionings began in the most historic discrimination lawsuit in journalism. The Daily News was being sued by 4 African American reporters, editors, 2 reporters, 2 editors, because of their years of discrimination, or the number of years they'd worked at the Daily News in which they were discriminated against. It's the first time that a lawsuit was brought against such an entity, meaning a major media organization, and taken to court. And it was a jury trial, and they lost. That has never happened, that had never happened before. One of the reasons I was hired at the Daily News was because they were trying to look good, and they needed to increase their numbers. Did I take that to mean I wasn't qualified for it? No. I took it to mean somebody gave me a job, and I was going to do a really good job at my job. But that was part of what framed the atmosphere that I worked under in the Daily News. Is the Daily News alone in this? No. This happens all over the media world. And maybe not, I don't know if it's worse. I'm not going to say it's worse at the news and better somewhere else. I think this goes on all over the media world. More is being written about it now. A recent book came out by NYU professor Pamela Newkirk called Within the Veil. That to do this book, she conducted a series of interviews with African-American reporters who worked in the mainstream. And this is basically a common theme that you hear. And I'm talking about her book so that you know my story is one example of a really common theme that you hear in the profession amongst people of color. Some of the stories in there are really quite dramatic. There was a reporter in California, a TV reporter who wore braids on TV, and, well, she's not a reporter today. She is not a reporter today. So the degree to which you're expected to fit in to a Eurocentric framework is awesome. And I look back on my time there and I think, well, what about me made them think that I would just be, you know, I would just fit in? And I can think of all the things. I went to Princeton, I went to Stanford. I'm a nice girl from Queens. So it was, what was there about me that they should feel threatened by? They didn't feel threatened by me. And one of the things that I discovered was that it really, it's beyond being a nice person. Anything that you come out with that more or less challenges a certain perception of how the world is structured and the power structure that exists now is questionable. And depending on and I'm not saying you can't get individuals who will deal with you fair. That's going to happen. That's life. That happens. But in terms of the generality of what's going on, this is our experience. What's happening now in the field? What kind of impact has this had? Journalists of color are leaving the field in droves. The American Society of Newspaper Editors did a study, came out, they did in 96, came out in 97. 18% of African-American journalists said that they think they'll stay in the field till they're 60. 18%. What does that mean? And the other question that we have to ask ourselves also, and this for me is the really big question that we deal with constantly now with the work with young people and mentoring young people, is what does it mean and what should we tell them? Should we say, oh my goodness, you're going to be tormented, tortured, and don't. No, that's not what it means. But at the same time, there's a level of significance about this that we have to contend with. Our challenge for the future, for young people going into journalism, is to go into the organization, be willing to challenge them, and make them understand that the challenge is about transforming the culture. Because some of my editors were African American running this nonsense by me. I'm not even going to go into the African American editor, when I need to talk to him about a story he wants to meet in the bar. Don't you have an office? Can't we just talk about the story up here before deadline? Do I have to go downstairs? So there are all manner of ridiculous things that go on, but what needs to change is the culture of these environments, because the change in culture is what's going to make them understand that the perspective needs to be broadened to include other voices, and that's our challenge as we go in there. And it's not an easy thing to talk about changing a culture, because when I started at the news and I had, you know, the whole thing with the suit going on and the whole attitude towards what I actually could do and couldn't do and all this other business was going on, people were sending me on ridiculous assignments. Go and find a homeless woman using her child as a prop to beg. It's midnight. What, you're refusing the assignment? No, I'm not refusing the assignment. I'm trying to understand exactly what the assignment is. You are to do a story about people who use their children as props to beg. That's what we want a story on. So yes, when I complained about that, because I think it's ridiculous. When I complained about that, you know, the editor reminded me, you know, Natalie, this is a rough and tumble environment. And we've got to get used to the rough and tumble culture. Well, I don't want to get used to the rough and tumble culture. I want you to look at me and accept the perspective that I come to this thing with, because it's valid. My experiences didn't start with the one you told me happened. That's what I want. And that's the fight in these organizations. So every time I see a story come out that just is so rich in its understanding of a larger context of things, and this is not, you know, this is not hard to do, mind you. What I'm talking about is, now we know why stories, the journalists in here especially, you know why bad information gets recycled. Because the process is, and I know the students know this, so you go to the clips first. You go to the clips and you get the information and you start building your story. Okay, fine. But if the clips has bad information, this stuff can get recycled very easily. But what the clips do, and this is even more important, what the clips do is it provides the same, the framework never changes. We look at the story in the same framework every time we look at it, because we're going back to the same clips. Open up the body of clips that we look at. So maybe when we talk about unemployment in communities of color, we can include a quote about the legacy of slavery. Can we get a context that helps to not vilify us? Can we get a context that helps to explain historically why certain communities exist in the way they exist? It's possible. They just don't want to hear about it. And that's the challenge. I'll end here and I will take questions.